Okay, thanks very much, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk to you guys. It's an honor and it's a pleasure, and it's actually because of you guys that I have the opportunity to spend all day, every day, researching some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about today, and that I hope will motivate you and inspire you to go out and do something. So the subject of my talk is the war on America, and war is a pretty strong word. It's it conjures up images of death and dying. But I don't think it's too strong of a word to describe what's happening to our country right now and the forces that are arrayed against us. There is a war against America, and it's raging all day, every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's been going on for generations, actually. That's how we ended up in the state that we're in. This didn't happen by accident. It was a coordinated assault on our nation and on everything that it was founded on. So it's obviously not just a war on America. It's also a war against you personally, and against your children, and against your country, and against your family. It's a war against liberty and against our Constitution. And outside of America, it's also a war on the people of Europe and on the people of Africa and the Middle East and China. And some people have actually experienced this war up close and in person. A lot of people have died as a result of this. Ed mentioned, hundreds of millions of people. It's a conservative estimate. If you think of all the people that the communists and the socialists murdered in the last century, it's a lot of dead people. People just like us, actually. Just like our kids, just like our parents, just like our sisters. And it's hard to wrap your mind around that. It's a huge thing. And we don't want that to come here, right? We don't want anything like that. We don't even want to think about it. But the fact is, the war is going on, and it's going to come to our doorstep. And you could even argue that it's already here. So, this is a war against a lot of things. It's a war even against humanity. And believe it or not, it's a war against God. And I know that sounds quite ridiculous, waging war against God. But the Bible tells us in Psalms 2 that the kings of the earth conspire against the Lord and against His anointed. And I take comfort from that verse because you know how God responds to this little war. He laughs at them. So, that's a source of encouragement to me, and I think it should be to all of us. There's a higher power than all these little conspirators and their war. But that doesn't absolve us from our responsibility to do something about this. The Bible also commands us to reprove evil and to expose evil. And we have a duty to expose this and to resist this evil as best we can in whatever ways we can. So divine intervention is, of course, a possibility. But for us to sit back and just expect that to come, I think would be an abdication of our responsibility to ourselves, to our family, to future generations, to those who came before us, to those who sacrificed their lives to bequeath our liberties and this country to us. So we need to face the reality that there is a war going on against us and our families and our liberty. It's a war that's global in scope, and if we lose this war, we are heading towards some very, very dark times. We're going to lose our liberty. What remains of our prosperity, I should say, is going to disappear along with it. And, the consequences of that, we need to think through it. No more First Amendment to say what we want, to worship how we want. No more Second Amendment to defend ourselves. No more Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, none of that. We'll do what we're told when we're told, or we'll face the consequences that other people have faced. And once our liberty and our sovereignty are gone, they're not coming back, right? If we lose, it's not going to be, oh, well, next week we'll take care of this, and then we'll solve this problem. That's not going to work. Once it's gone, it's gone. So we need to take the opportunity now, while we still can, while we have lawful means to resist this evil. We need to do that. And we need to do it as if our lives and our liberties and our families depended on it, because they do. So tonight I want to talk to you about a few issues. Time constraints obviously prevent us from getting into everything, but I want to explore 3 issues in particular that I think are kind of representative of what's going on. You won't get the complete picture tonight. I won't have time to get into the Federal Reserve and the dollar and the wars and so many issues that we need to talk about, that we need to be educated on. But I will talk about some of the areas where I think I might say I have a little bit of expertise, areas that I've looked at up close and personal, things that I've spent a lot of time studying. And I hope that you'll find it useful. Let's see if I can, there we go. So we're going to talk about dumbed down education. That's the subject of the book that I co-authored with Dr. Blumenfeld. The American people did not get this ignorant by accident. To believe that is, quite frankly, ridiculous. This was a plan. It was orchestrated. We have the primary source documents showing it. And I hope that you will educate yourselves on this, because really the future of our nation actually depends on this. If they manage to get the minds of the young, that's it, right? Every dictator has always understood that. That's why they've had such an obsession with using the schools to indoctrinate the children. So we need to understand that if we are going to make it out of this. Of course, I'll talk about the climate hoax and the sustainable development hoax. These are some more issues that I've had a chance to observe up close and personal. I've been to a few of these UN climate summits. I went to the UN Sustainable Development Summit down in Rio de Janeiro a few years ago. So I've seen what these people are up to. I've seen what they say, and I want to share a little bit of that with you. We'll talk about the refugee crisis. I just got back from Europe a few months ago. We drove from Stockholm to Spain and then back to Stockholm. So we saw a lot of this actually right when all these terrorist attacks were going on in Paris. So, you know, it was really something to behold, and I want to share a little bit of that with you guys. And we'll talk about kind of the process of building this so-called New World Order, which is their term, not mine. But I want to just explain kind of their modus operandi. Unfortunately, we won't have time to talk about the money, but we will talk about solutions and potential solutions that we can all do in our spheres of influence. So, crimes of the educators, how utopians are using government schools to destroy America's children. We mentioned Dr. Sam Blumenfeld. He was in this for 50 years, right? This was his passion. Because of him, there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, I don't know, of children in this country who can read, maybe some of your own children. It's because of Sam's research that my children can read, and that a lot of children in my community, people that I know, can read. If it had not been for Sam's work, we would have had no idea. Our children would have been just as damaged as the ones coming out of government schools today. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, Crimes of the Educators, it's a strong title, I realize that. And some of the crimes that we identify are very strong as well. So what Sam and I concluded is that the education establishment is quite literally a criminal enterprise in the truest sense of the word. I'm not using hyperbole. It is a criminal enterprise, and we identify specific prosecutable crimes that are being perpetrated every day by the education establishment, which is, of course, one arm of the broader establishment. And treason is the first and most serious one. We argue that the deliberate dumbing down of a nation for the purpose of overthrowing its system of government and its liberties is treason. It's part of the war against America. You know, if you're an American and you're waging war on your own country and your own constitution, you're committing treason. And I think the people who have orchestrated this situation that we find ourselves in meet that criteria very well. Child abuse, another strong term, but we argue that deliberately harming the mind and the spirit of a child is child abuse. And you know, what the modern neuroscience shows is that this quack literacy that we'll talk about in just a minute is actually physically damaging the brains of children. So this is child abuse in our view, and it needs to be stopped. Contributing to the delinquency of a minor. I think a lot of people would be shocked and appalled if they saw the pornographic so-called sex education that's taking place in the schools. And this is now moving to a global level. We'll talk a little bit about that. They want to teach 4-year-olds things that I would not mention in any company, much less in front of you gentlemen and ladies. It's mind-boggling what's happening, and we consider this a crime. You know, the direct effect of this kind of pseudo-education is to encourage children to go out and have premarital sex, which leads to, you know, abortions and venereal disease. It's just so much wickedness, it's hard to wrap your mind around it. And we talk a little bit about that in the book. Destroying belief in biblical religion. You know, the Bible tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So if you're destroying the fear of the Lord, if you're telling the children that the Bible is a hoax and that your parents are stupid and, you know, you don't need to believe that stuff, I mean, you're destroying the foundation of knowledge and the foundation of wisdom. So what do we have these schools for? It's absolutely ridiculous. And they do it using lies, too. You know, we talk some about that in the book. You know, they promote, they actually do promote religion in the schools. They won't tell you that, but you know, they promote humanism. Even the courts actually have found humanism to be a religion. The early humanists all admitted this was a religion, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And the Bible says something about people who offend the little ones who believe in Christ, right? You know, it would be better for them to have a millstone tied around their neck. So, you know, they will face justice one day, but in the meantime, we need to protect our children from these people. And drug pushing, right? So the schools cause all these problems in the children. They mess up their minds. They destroy their ability to read. And then in response, instead of removing these quack methods and removing this pornography from the schools, they put them on drugs, serious drugs. Things like amphetamines, things that you would go to jail for giving to somebody without a so-called doctor's note. And the schools push this stuff. You have 1 out of 10 boys in American government schools now who are taking hardcore amphetamine drugs to deal with these alleged disorders that the schools are largely responsible for producing. So all these are very serious crimes. And then we get to fraud and extortion. Right? They told us that they were going to educate our kids if we surrendered a bunch of money on property taxes and so on. Are they educating our kids? No, they're not. They're doing the opposite of that. And if a businessman came to you and told you your product was going to do such and such, and it did the opposite of that, well, you would consider yourself defrauded. And you would take the person to court. The person would be prosecuted for fraud. But that's exactly what is happening with this government education system. They're telling us that, you give us the money, we'll educate your kids, and they're doing the exact opposite. They're producing lifelong disabilities in these children, and it's unconscionable. So these are just some of the crimes that we argue are being perpetrated. If you get the book or, you read more about it, I'll talk a little bit about some of these later on. I think you'll agree that these are real crimes. They're being perpetrated right this instant, and we as parents and grandparents and all of that have a duty to protect our children and our grandchildren from this kind of craziness and this wickedness. So I'm not the only one, and Dr. Blumenfeld's not the only one who came up with this idea that we're having a war waged against us. In 1983, President Reagan had a commission, the National Commission on Excellence in Education. And this is what they concluded, that if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose this on America, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. So, we argue that just because some domestic forces put this horror in place doesn't make it any less an act of war. It just makes it treason, because they're not foreigners, they're domestic enemies. So this is a disaster. The same commission, and bureaucracies and government commissions aren't really known for their colorful language, so this is strong stuff. They say the educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and as a people. So the government told us that our future as a nation and our future as a people is under threat from the education system. And yet the situation has gotten much, much worse since 1983, if you can believe that. So how did we get here? Americans used to be pretty well educated, actually. John Adams, one of our early presidents, he said that a native of America who cannot read is as rare in appearance as a comet or an earthquake. Maybe you guys have seen a comet or two or an earthquake or two, but you don't see them very often, right? So it's very rare indeed. Thomas Jefferson used to brag that American farmers were the only ones in the world who read Homer. Nowadays people would have no idea who Homer is. So, we've fallen quite a long way, unfortunately. And the reason, back then was that everybody needed to read the Bible. One of the earliest education laws in the United States, if not the earliest, actually it wasn't even the United States back then, it was the colonies. The Old Deluder Satan Act in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1647. They said everybody needs to read, because if they can't read, they won't know Scripture. And if they don't know Scripture, then the devil will come around here and we'll trick them and we'll deceive them, and then we'll have big problems. So everyone needs to learn how to read. So, that's why we had schools in the first place, so that children would learn to read so that they could know Scripture. Now today it's the exact opposite, right? Today, just to give you guys a quick snapshot of where we are, it's really hard to believe this is true. I encourage everybody to go look up these statistics on their own. The federal government did a literacy survey in 1993. They found that 55% of Americans could barely read. So they had 5 categories, 5 being the best, 1 being the worst. 55% of people were at 1 and 2. So that is unbelievably atrocious. 2/3 of D.C. residents, this was just a recent statistic that came out from a state education agency report, 2/3 of Washington, D.C. residents are functionally illiterate. So they might be able to read a stop sign, but they might be able to read the Campbell's soup label. But when it comes to reading the Constitution, when it comes to reading Scripture, when it comes to reading a history book, no chance at all. So Jeb Bush's foundation, Jeb Bush, weird source to use, but he found that 80% of 18-year-olds are unprepared for college work. And college work these days has become a joke, so that really says something right there. 1/3 can't pass a military entrance exam. The OECD ranks the U.S. 27th place out of 34 in math, and it's going down. SAT scores, this for me was fascinating. We looked at how you can objectively show that Americans are becoming dumber and dumber and dumber and more ignorant the more money we throw at this problem. If you look at the SAT, every 10 years or so, they need to dumb them down, because if they didn't, it would be so obvious to everybody that the American people are getting dumber and more ignorant. It's unbelievable, and yet there is the objective evidence that this is what's happening. So we also looked at some of the tests that were given out in middle school back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and I hate to admit it, but it was hard stuff for me. You know, it was really complicated math, history, climatology, geography, just, I mean, mind-boggling that, you know, 7th and 8th graders could do that back then. Today, you know, college professors would really struggle with a lot of that. So how did this happen? Now, I'm going to give you guys a very brief summary of how we got to this dismal situation. Here's one of the guys who got us started on this road. His name is Horace Mann. He was the first ever education secretary that we had in the U.S. He was the education secretary of Massachusetts, and he was appointed in 1837. He went to Prussia, and he was quite impressed with this statist model of schooling. Basically, what the Prussian government had done was compel everyone to surrender their children to government education, and in addition to compelling, they wanted to train up the children to become obedient to the state in all matters. So really there were statist indoctrination programs, and Horace Mann thought that would be a very good thing to bring to the United States. He thought it would equalize people if everybody got the same statist education, so they segregated the children by age and really indoctrinated them with this kind of statism. Now, you know, back then I'm sure the schools were much better than they were today, but this really got the process started. So he implemented that in Massachusetts and started spreading it across America to all the different states. And then the architects of this current disaster that we have seized the architecture that Horace Mann put in place, and they were able to quite successfully hijack that and use it for the disaster that we have today. This really deserves, you know, a week worth of talk, but I'm going to try to condense it into one slide because it's so important that people understand this. I encourage you to, you know, if you have kids, if you have grandkids, you need to understand this. It is absolutely crucial. So, Mann pushed what's called today the whole word method. Sometimes it's called the look-say method or the sight word method. Basically, you know, to put it in a nutshell, it's trying to teach the reading of English as if it were Chinese. So you get the kids to memorize whole words as if they were symbols. You see the little picture here. You've got the picture of the fish and then fish written under it. You've got the picture of the fork and then fork written under it. So in this method of reading, you would look at that word and you would memorize it as if that was one symbol in and of itself, as opposed to a group of symbols, each one representing a sound. Now that's phonics, where each letter has one or more sounds associated with it. You learn how to combine them, and then you can read any word. If you learn to read using this quack sight method, well, then you can read the words you've memorized, sort of, you know, not even that well. But when you get to a word you don't know, you're going to struggle. You're going to have to guess it from the context cues and all this other quackery they talk about. So Mann was actually the original proponent of this. They tried it out in the government schools of Boston, and it was such a disaster that after a few years, they yanked it out, and the headmasters of the schools got together and they penned a brilliant essay debunking this quackery, and you know, that should have been the end of the story. It was so ridiculous. The headmaster said this was so outrageous. It flies in the face of all logic. And yet, it's in every government school in this country today, unless you have a rogue teacher who secretly teaches the students with phonics. Sometimes they'll try to conceal it. They'll say, we use a balanced approach, or we teach a little bit of phonics. Don't fall for that stuff. What they're doing is they're teaching the kids to memorize words, and then later, after they've caused this faulty process to occur in the brain, this faulty reflex to develop, they'll say, now we'll teach you a little bit of phonics. So now you can learn that a P sounds like a P. And at that point, it's useless. You've already got the reflex to try to read words as symbols. And so you will never become a good reader unless you go through this arduous, horrible process of unlearning that reflex. So Sam was able to do that, but it was very hard work. The people who he did it with described the process as painful. So the simplest solution is just don't get suckered into this in the first place. Don't let your kids be damaged in this way, because undoing the damage is very, very difficult. So this produces what a lot of people who look at this, they call whole word dyslexia. So you know, you get people who read ton as not, for example, and this is exactly why. You know, maybe not every person who has what's called dyslexia was a result of this, but probably the great majority. Even Dr. Seuss, who actually was involved in this. If you read, you know, Sam I Am, these things were designed to get children to memorize sight words. He said later in life, he said, I think killing phonics was one of the greatest causes of illiteracy in the country. So, you know, Mann tried it. It failed miserably. They yanked it out of the schools. But then it came back. John Dewey, maybe you guys have heard of him. He is considered the godfather of government schools today. I mean, he's worshipped in you know, progressive circles as the founder, really, of American education. So he was a few things. We'll talk real briefly about them. He was a socialist, first of all. He loved the statist model of education. He is really the one who launched the plot to dumb down the American people. So, man, we can give him the benefit of the doubt, assume he had good intentions. Dewey did not. I have a lot of quotes from him. I'll go through just a few I think that are the most revealing. He says, "The only form of enduring social organization that is now possible is one in which the new forces of productivity are cooperatively controlled. Organized social planning is now the sole method of social action by which liberalism can realize its professed aims." So he went to the Soviet Union. He thought Lenin was doing a stupendous job, creating this socialist utopia over there. He wanted to see what they were doing in the schools. And so who else would you want to found your government education system than a guy who admires the Soviet Union? He cited Looking Backward. It was a novel by Edward Bellamy published in 1888 as the model he wanted to see for America. This was a fantasy novel, of course. It was about a communist America in the year 2000 with no private property, and Dewey thought that would be a wonderful model for America. He said if people would just read it and give it a chance. In fairness to Dewey, he didn't have the last 100 years that we've witnessed to realize what a disaster these ideas would be. He didn't see National Socialism in Germany, exterminating 6 million people. He didn't see the purges that Stalin engaged in, 100 million, 200 million people dead. So we can say maybe he didn't realize what a horror this would all turn out to be. But, he should have known. He should have known better. So what else was John Dewey? He was also a humanist. We talked a little bit about humanism in the schools. Well, back then they admitted humanism was a religion. Dewey was one of the signers of Humanist Manifesto 1, the very first Humanist Manifesto, the kickoff of the Humanist Revolution, the Humanist Manifesto, the Humanist religion. And the very first plank of this, first, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. For those of you who remember the opening words of your Bible, you'll see there's a fundamental conflict here, right? In the beginning, God created, or the universe is self-existing and not created. It's only one or the other. Dewey believed this, and this is what's in the schools today. We as Christians and Jews and Muslims, we don't believe that, right? But this is the religion that's taught to our children in school as fact, when of course it is no such thing. They also say in the same declaration that Dewey signed, "We are convinced that the time has passed for theism and deism and these things." And they were also openly hoping to nationalize the economy, right? They said, humanists are firmly convinced that existing acquisitive and profit motive society has shown itself to be inadequate and that a radical change in methods, controls, and motives must be instituted. A socialized and cooperative economic order must be established to the end that the equitable distribution of the means of life be possible. So they're talking about socialism, right, in plain English. And then John Dewey was also a self-styled educator, right? He was a utopian, and he believed that education was going to be the key to implementing this socialist vision that he wanted to see in the United States. So that's why he went into the field of education. He said education is a regulation of the process of coming to share in the social consciousness. Is that why you send your kids to school? No, I didn't think so, right? I don't know anybody who sends their kids to school for that. He says adjustment of individual activity on the basis of social consciousness is the only sure method of social reconstruction. Did you send your kids so that, to school so we could have social reconstruction? I mean, today we might call it social engineering, right? And so this is his idea of education. He actually outlined this plan in an essay called The Primary Education Fetish, published in 1898. We actually reprinted it in the book because it's so important. And in there, he says, these are his words from that essay, change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So, he knew that nobody would put up with this kind of lunacy if they knew what was happening, and he said so himself. So they had to do it quietly. They had to do it under the radar without people realizing what was happening, or people would have rejected it, of course. He received millions of dollars in funding and support from the Rockefeller dynasty. They had this thing called the General Education Board, and he used that money to establish an experimental school where he tried out this quackery and realized the kind of damage it did, and he used it to promote this quackery. He also used his leadership positions at these educational institutions to promote his agenda. So he and a bunch of his colleagues, really radical people today, even by today's standards, eugenicists, people who believed these quack theories about race, and Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was one of these eugenicists, of course. And so they introduced this behavioral psychology into the schools, and they produced new books to teach reading. At the University of Chicago, we had Dick and Jane. Probably some of you guys remember that book from your day. And then at Teachers College at Columbia University, and that name should ring a bell too, some of Obama's terrorist friends are from there, right? Bill Ayers, right? And so they came up with the Macmillan reading program. So these were whole word methodologies to teach reading, and the damage they did to the American people and to our country is incalculable. It's off the charts, unbelievable. So again, with Rockefeller money, they promoted these books, and it started to take off after World War II because there was all this money floating around and all the schools could buy new textbooks. So this quackery was actually exposed again in 1955 by Rudolph Flesch. He wrote this book, Why Johnny Can't Read, and a lot of parents were outraged, right? The schools didn't want to change anything, but parents were so furious when they realized why their children couldn't read that there was this kind of uproar. And it wasn't the first time these had been exposed. Remember, the Boston schoolmasters had exposed this as quackery 100 years earlier. Actually, there was people in between then who also attacked this as quackery, and yet it persists to this day, even though we know, neuroscience, we can do brain scans now, we can see the physical damage that this is doing to the minds of children, and it continues. So, there's only one possible explanation of that, and that's that these people know what they're doing, and they're doing it deliberately. This is the outcome that they want. So, how did we get the feds in the classroom? Well, the 10th Amendment, of course, prohibits the feds in the classroom, right? But that never stopped the feds, at least not in recent generations, thanks to this dumbed-down education. But in 1965, they figured out, you know what, if we send a little bit of federal funding, we can really start hijacking education policy, curriculum policy, and what goes on in the schools. And so that was really the camel's nose under the tent, so to speak, and it only got worse from there. In 1979, Congress made the Education Department a cabinet-level department. Jimmy Carter had promised it to his union buddies at the National Education Association. That's a whole other can of worms. Dr. Blumenfeld wrote a fantastic book about the NEA. If you're interested, The Trojan Horse. It blew my mind, I'll tell you, when I read it. You think it's bad, you don't know the first thing. It is so bad you can't even imagine. So the budget went from $14 billion back then to $77 billion today. Of course, the children are dumber and more ignorant than ever before, and we're spending more than ever before. And today we have federal guidelines on everything from sexual education to discipline to school lunches to the gender of the textbook writers to everything you can think about. And Charlotte Iserbyt, actually, she was working in the Reagan administration at the Department of Education, and she got to see this firsthand, and she leaked some of the documents. So, we know a lot of what was happening. We know that they were signing agreements with the Soviet Union to let the Soviets into the classroom, and just really, really nasty stuff. Here's just a quick chart. You can see the blue line right there is the total cost of so-called education in America. Down there, you can see the results on so-called America's report card. It's a standardized test. You have literacy, reading, reading, math, and science, and we can spend as much money until the cows come home. It's not going to make any difference. The kids are going to keep getting dumber and dumber. So Common Core, I won't talk a lot about that. We do have some Common Core material in the back, special reprint from some articles we did, and I know Dr. Pesta has been here to talk to you guys about it. He's really done a lot of the work on exposing Common Core. But just a real quick summary for those who aren't as familiar. Basically, the Obama administration used a combination of bribes and bludgeoning to force this on our states. You take the federal money, then you got to submit to the federal agenda. And just to give you, just one quick piece of evidence of how bad this is, there was 2 subject matter experts on this committee, the Common Core Validation Committee. It was supposed to be a rubber stamp committee. 2 subject matter experts only. The first one, Dr. Sandra Stotsky, I've interviewed her, very nice lady. She's not opposed to national standards in principle, but she said these standards are so bad, they're going to reduce the critical thinking of the American people, they're going to strip the classic literature out, they're going to dumb down the kids, so I'm not going to sign off on them. And so they ignored her. They threw her name down the memory hole. She didn't exist anymore. But, she was the only English language arts expert on this committee, and she said this is a disaster, do not do it. Then we had Dr. James Milgram, the only math expert from Stanford University. He also is not opposed to national standards on principle, but he said the math standards are unclear, confusing, as unchallenging as possible, and in some cases they're actually based on inaccurate math, believe it or not. So your kids are now learning from national standards if they go to government school, that some of which are based on incorrect math. So that is, a real travesty. With all these, they got $2 billion from Bill Gates, they got money from the federal government, and they couldn't even write accurate math standards. It's hard to believe, but it is what it is. So the dumbing down is being stepped up, accelerated, and the Common Core actually does use this whole word method, the cite method, although they disguise it with a little bit of phonics, like we talked about earlier, to kind of disguise what they're doing. But they call this the balanced approach, right? It's balanced quackery. And then some of this is actually even infecting the Catholic schools and the private schools and the home schools. And if these people get their way, it's going to affect all schools and all Americans, right? They don't want even one little kid to escape this, because then you have the situation, you know, with the boy who exposed the emperor who was wearing no clothes. You know, if one person escapes the brainwashing, they figure that one person might, you know, blow the whole thing up. So they don't want to take that risk. So where is this all going? Well, we're marching very quickly, and it's not even a secret at this point. They brag about it on their websites. We're moving toward a global education system with global education standards, and so we'll just basically take the dumbing down to the global level, and all of humanity will be dumbed down together. So nobody will know any better, right? We'll all be dumbed together. Now, UNESCO was actually founded for the purpose of bringing about a global government and socialism and humanism. They said so right when they started it. It was never a secret. The first Secretary General of UNESCO, Julian Huxley, and yes, that was Aldous Huxley's brother, he said the goal was political unification in some sort of world government. They put out a pamphlet in 1949, a series. They said schools should be used to combat family attitudes. That's you, right? They don't want your attitudes being passed on to your children. The UNESCO today runs programs called Education for Sustainable Development. We'll look at that a little more. Education for World Citizenship. And in 2004, they signed a deal with Bill Gates, the financier of Common Core. They were going to come up with a master curriculum to basically dumb down the teachers and to bring in the technology into this global system. And that is what we're dealing with today, believe it or not. You know, they say Common Core is nationalizing education. Well, it's a step toward globalizing education, and that is what we're seeing. UNESCO also provides training manuals for teachers, handy-dandy, right? And they have everything from sex education for kindergartners. They teach, you know, 9-year-olds how to successfully promote safe and legal abortions. Yes, they do. They recommend the whole word method. Sam called their proposed literacy strategy, they want this in the whole world, the most ridiculous thing he had ever seen. And he saw a lot of ridiculous things in 50 years of looking at this quack literacy phenomenon. They want to promote humanism. They tell you they want to promote humanism and multiculturalism. The notion that, you know, all cultures are equally valid. You know, cannibalism and human sacrifices. You know, the same differences. Yeah, except Western culture, of course, is evil in every sense. So multiculturalism, all cultures are equal except Western civilization. That is evil, and that we should be quite ashamed of. So they actually do have a World Core curriculum, believe it or not. If it sounds like Common Core, good, it should. And this was developed by Robert Mueller. He was the Undersecretary General of the United Nations, and he dedicated his standards. You know, so this is all out in the open. There's nothing secret here. He dedicated his standards to Alice Bailey. Now, you know, this is a deep rabbit hole. We could talk about this for quite a while. She was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company, bigwig at the United Nations. Really, she was. She used to invite these, she called them ascended masters, these spirit entities that would come into her and help her write these books. You know, any Christian will know automatically what that is. These are demons. And these demons would help write things like Education in the New Age, where she talked about the education in the New Age, as you might imagine. So the World Core curriculum is dedicated to Alice Bailey. So the Core must teach the child to see himself or herself as a part of the greater whole. So that's where we're moving. The current head of UNESCO is an actual communist. She came from the Bulgarian Communist Party. Her father was the editor of the chief propaganda organ of the Bulgarian Communist Party, also a member of the Politburo. She's next in line to be the Secretary General of the UN. She's currently the front runner. And her entire campaign team is actually agents from the state security apparatus in Bulgaria. Now, for those of you who don't know, the People's Republic of Bulgaria murdered at least 222,000 people, according to the world's leading expert on democide. So they tortured Christians, they threw people in the gulags. It was an absolutely monstrous apparatus. And this is where the head of UNESCO comes from, actually. They changed the name of the party. It's no longer the Bulgarian Communist Party. Now it's the Bulgarian Socialist Party. Same people, same deal, same ideology, and that's who's running UNESCO. So, you know, who else would we want to educate our children than these people, right? Arne Duncan, he was the Secretary of Education until just very, very recently, a few months ago, Obama's Secretary of Education. You can go on the Department of Education's website and look up his speeches. I encourage you to do that because he talks about UNESCO as his global partner in this cradle-to-career education reform movement around the world. He says he's going to create green global citizens out of your children, and he's going to use education as a weapon to change the world. He actually quoted a communist terrorist saying that education was a weapon to change the world. And he's going to make your kids into green global citizens. And he brags about it openly. It's published on the Department of Education's website. So that's where we're going. Here's a quote straight from the United Nations. They have a toolkit for education for sustainable development. They say that generally, more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who tend to have lower incomes. So in this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. So do you suppose they want educated people? No, they don't, right? And they tell us so. This is, again, straight from the UN's website. So enough about education. We'll get straight into the climate and sustainability hoax. I apologize for the speed, guys. People always tell me I talk too fast. I have so much information I want to get to you guys, and hopefully they're recording, and if you didn't catch everything, maybe you can watch it again or something. But climate and sustainability. So first of all, it's based on pseudoscience. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll expose some of the pseudoscience. I'll give you everything you need to know to realize that the theory is incorrect. The goal is, of course, total global control, just like the goal of the education system is total global control. And then here is a gentleman, Trofim Lysenko. I always bring him up when I talk about climate because this is what this reminds me of. He was a Soviet so-called scientist, and he had this quack theory on genetics that Stalin really liked. And Stalin decreed that that was the truth and nobody could challenge it. And they threw people in the gulags for saying that the theory was quackery. And in the end, the truth still did come out. So I think we can take encouragement from that. But it was a dark time to be in the Soviet Union if you realized that this theory was ridiculous. And unfortunately, there are a lot of parallels between what we call Lysenkoism today and what's happening with the so-called global warming debate. So a lot of you probably remember the global cooling agenda, right? Just not that long ago, actually. From the 60s through all the way to the early 80s, it was the global cooling phenomenon. We were all going to freeze to death, and the crops were going to stop growing because it was going to be so cold. And Newsweek, right? And Newsweek was not alone. There was all kinds. So I don't pick on Newsweek just to pick on them, but all the big publications were talking about this. They had an article, The Cooling World, and they said man-made global cooling is going to cause famine, and climatologists are pessimistic that the government is going to do anything to fix it, right? Where have we heard that before? They had some really interesting solutions for how we should deal with this. One of them was melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot. Really, Al Gore would have a heart attack, right? Because he keeps saying it's going to go away, and it's still there. And they cited all kinds of impressive sources, right? The National Academy of Sciences, the NOAA, Columbia University. How prestigious, right? And Obama's science czar, John Holdren, he's the guy who loves forced abortions and said so. He thought that man-made global cooling caused by man's emissions of carbon dioxide were going to kill 1 billion people. Really, he did, and now he's the science czar. He rails about global warming. We'll get back to him in a minute. And his solution, just like the solution of the global cooling alarmists at the time, we need a global government, we need economic controls, we need to give up our liberty, and we need population control. So if those solutions sound familiar, good, they should, because those are the same solutions they're giving us for alleged global warming. So here is from Newsweek's article. You can take a look there at the global cooling stuff that's supposed to be coming. And of course, now we're not worried about global cooling anymore, right? Maybe we should be, actually. I've talked to some very respectable scientists with really serious credentials who've looked at this and said, actually, global cooling maybe is coming. It's not man-made, but it might be good to prepare. But anyway, so after global cooling scare, we got the global warming scare. They realized that that might be more plausible. And so the ridiculous warming predictions have actually fared no better than the cooling predictions. I've tried to find predictions that they've made that have come true, and trust me, it's hard. It's almost like God has a sense of humor, I tell you. They say something will happen, and then the opposite happens, really. It's mind-boggling how consistent it is. So you had the alarmists such as Al Gore, NASA scientists, BBC. They all said that the Arctic was going to be ice-free by 2013. They said this in 2007. And then the NASA scientists said, maybe even that's too conservative. Maybe it's going to be before. We'll have to see. So, of course, 2013 came and went, and the Arctic is still doing just fine, right? Then Antarctica. They've been telling us for years that Antarctica was losing ice and it was causing sea level rise and blue. And this is in the UN reports. You can read it. They say the Antarctic is losing ice and it's going to raise the sea level. And then it turns out that no, that's not true. Actually, Antarctica has been gaining massive amounts of ice. Trillions of tons of ice have been gained on top of the land in Antarctica. And then the sea, we have the same thing. Actually, in recent years, we've had world records. Since records began, we have never had so much sea sea ice around Antarctica. It's really extraordinary. You know, they said it was going to disappear, and so God gave us record Antarctic sea ice. So here is a global warming ship. They went to go study global warming in Antarctica in the summer. They were going to show us how the ice was gone. Really, I promise it. So there they are. They got stuck in the ice. Really, really funny. And I think it's a perfect metaphor, right? They had to fly out with helicopters and all kinds of ice-breaking shit, guzzling fossil fuels, you know, hydrocarbons to save these guys. And I think they bought some carbon credits to offset their emissions. But it was really funny. Really, really funny story. And so here's really everything you need to know to understand that their theory is wrong, right? They told us that as CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere increased, warming was going to increase and accelerate. Well, that didn't happen. We have satellite data and we have weather balloon data that show we have had no observable global warming in 18 years, maybe 21 years, depending on how you look at it, 58 according to the weather balloons. And that means that every single model that the United Nations has based its predictions on was wrong. They made 73 models to calculate what was going to happen. Every single one predicted warming. Here's the average of them, that red line there. That's what was supposed to happen based on the average of UN models. Down there on the green and the blue is what the observable evidence shows us. So a monkey rolling a set of dice would have actually had a much better chance of predicting what was going to happen to temperatures than the United Nations, really. It's, and you know, it discredits their theory. So they've come up with new theories to explain this. You know, they're having a really tough time. But they say that the ocean ate my global warming. That's the preferred excuse right now. They say that the heat is hiding somewhere down there, and we didn't forecast this, but it really is there, trust us. And some leaked documents, we found out that the Obama administration was pressuring the UN to include this ocean ate my global warming theory in their report. So there you have it. You know, if their theory was correct, we should have had increased warming. We didn't have increased warming, therefore their theory is incorrect. Now we have climate change, right? So, you know, then if it gets colder, warmer, you know, nothing, it'll always be climate change. But, you know, this goes right to, I mean, it's so simple, right? The null hypothesis is that the climate has always changed. We've always seen the climate changing, right? It has always changed. It's gotten colder, it's gotten warmer, different things have happened. And so we would expect that to continue, right? Now, if humans are having some effect on this, then the burden is on the alarmists to show that. And unfortunately for them, fortunately for us, they have not succeeded because, you know, that's a very, very tough job. And, you know, here we have some of this evidence of climate change. That right there is a Viking church that was built in Greenland back when the Vikings were farming on Greenland. You know, good luck trying to farm on Greenland today. It's way too cold. So there you go. Climate change at work, climate change long before your SUV was on the road, there was climate change, right? So the Vikings eventually had to move. So the real agenda here is demonizing carbon dioxide. Now, you probably heard Obama and Al Gore and the UN talk about carbon pollution, right? It probably sounds really scary. Nobody likes pollution, and carbon sounds scary, but really, carbon dioxide is the gas of life. You know, talk to any scientist who knows what they're talking about, and they will tell you carbon dioxide is the gas of life. It is essential to all life on this planet. The plants need it. You exhale it. Carbon dioxide is crucial to life. Without it, everything is done. We're cooked, right? There's no more human beings, no more plants. It's over. So Earth is currently starving for CO2, right? That's why farmers who have greenhouses pump carbon dioxide in there, because plants have optimum levels of CO2, and almost all of them would like to have more carbon dioxide than we currently have in the atmosphere. They were designed to have more carbon dioxide than we currently have in the atmosphere, and we know for a fact that at past periods in the Earth's history, we've had a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So, you know, they don't want to talk about this, but they don't dispute it, because you can't dispute it. These are all facts. But we're supposed to believe that our breath, every time you exhale, you're exhaling pollution, and that we need to submit to global regulations and UN taxes on this alleged pollution. So they say that the CO2 causes the greenhouse effect. Well, what they also don't tell you is that human emissions of CO2 make up a fraction of 1% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This is also indisputable. You can talk to any global warmist you want, and they will reluctantly acknowledge that human emissions of CO2 make up a fraction of 1% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Water vapor is 95%. And the rest is, you know, different greenhouse gases. And then, of course, there's lots of CO2 that's in the atmosphere, regardless of what humans do, right? When plants decompose, when animals decompose, comes out of the oceans, comes out of the volcanoes, comes from all kinds of sources. So human emissions of CO2 are a fraction of 1%. And, you know, if one big volcano blew up, it could dwarf all of the carbon emissions that humans have ever put out since we were put here. So, you know, we're expected to believe that this fraction of 1% of carbon dioxide that's, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is driving catastrophic global warming, and we're all going to die unless we submit to global taxes and global regulation and agree that our breath is pollution. Now, frankly, I find that ridiculous. And, it's funny that it's the same solution for global cooling and all these things. So, that is the real agenda. Imagine from a bureaucrat's perspective what you could accomplish if you could convince people that everything they do, ranging from sitting on a couch and breathing to driving a car to producing electricity, produces this pollution that you need to pay taxes on and regulate. And that's what they're after, right? They tell us that's what they're after. So there's no secret. They've told us they want to tax this. They want to regulate it at the global level, at the regional level. And so that is what they're after, right? And they tell us, here's a big sign. We saw lots of people carrying this sign in Paris. They want system change, not climate change. And you can ask them what they mean, and they'll tell you. They don't like capitalism. They don't like free markets. They want socialism. That's what they mean by system change. And they think that the global warming hoax will be a good tool to advance that at the global level, right? The UN should be in charge of all this. So they want to use carbon dioxide to crush national sovereignty and to empower what they call global governance. It's a little bit less intimidating maybe than global government, but they're still doing the same thing. And this is standard rhetoric from, I call them the globalists, or you can call them internationalists, whatever you want, as opposed to, people who believe in the nation state and God created the nations, right? Well, these people don't like the nations. They want globalism. So they call it the New World Order, and they say that the global warming is a global problem, just like everything else, and therefore requires a global solution. And only the UN can give us global solutions, right? So they actually outlined this in 1991. The Club of Rome, for those of you who don't know, it's a big gathering of prominent globalists and communists. Mikhail Gorbachev is there, Al Gore is there, all these bigwigs. They came together with the Club of Rome, and they put out this report. As the Cold War was supposedly coming to an end, they needed a new enemy to unite humanity, right, to justify the totalitarianism and the UN scheming. So they found it. They said, in searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution and the threat of global warming and water shortages and famine would fit the bill. These dangers are caused by human intervention. And the real enemy then is humanity itself. So we're the enemy of ourselves, right? And only the UN can save us. So it's wonderful how that works. So if humanity is the enemy of the earth and of humanity, well, then we need some people to come and save us from this enemy. And that's why we need to surrender our sovereignty and our liberty and our money to the United Nations and to our governments and to these regional governments that they're building and empowering under the guise of the climate hoax. And in this UN Paris Agreement, and it is a treaty, make no mistake, regardless of whether Obama calls it a treaty or presents it to the Senate, it is still a treaty. It says shall, I forget how many times, now 20-something times. So these are obligations being imposed on us under this UN treaty. And basically, they are bringing together this global system. Now, of course, they didn't get everything they wanted. If you want to learn more about the Paris Agreement, you can read all about it in here. We have a number of the things that I'm talking about now you'll read about in here, actually, the exposing the global warming hoax, the pseudoscience, the Paris Agreement. We'll talk about Agenda 2030. We have a big article about it in here. So if this is a subject that's interesting for you, be sure to pick up a copy of this. And actually there's a lot of quotes from these people. I've only chosen a select few because of time constraints, but I just want to let you guys hear it from, the reason I use so many quotes is not because I like to hear what these people have to say, it's because I want you guys to hear it straight from the horse's mouth, right? You don't know me, you have no reason to believe me, but maybe you can believe them. So here's the chairwoman of the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Climate Change Convention, or Convention on Climate Change. So she's been running these UN global warming summits in recent years, and she said this in Doha in 2012, it must be understood that what is occurring here in the whole climate change process is a complete transformation of the economic structure of the world. So system change, right? Complete transformation. Obama talks about a fundamental transformation too. This is at the global level, right? It's not just fundamental transformation of America. This is of the whole world. These guys are ambitious. And because every economic activity produces CO2, again, just sitting, all of you guys are emitting CO2 right there. So basically everything needs to be controlled under the guise of dealing with this supposed problem. Here's some more. So governments need to decide what kind of energy we're going to use, if we're going to be allowed any, right? No nuclear power, no hydrocarbons, so maybe we're going to power it all on unicorn poots and rainbows, who knows. But they talk about carbon budgets for individuals and for nations, right? So nations are going to get carbon budgets and individuals will get carbon budgets. After you've used up your carbon budget, then you're in trouble, right? Because again, breathing emits CO2, so then that's a big problem. But here's the Prime Minister of India, and to his credit, he said, you know what, I don't care what you guys say, I'm going to build lots of power plants because my people need energy. But he also said that justice demands that with what little carbon we can still safely burn, developing countries are allowed to grow. So what happens if America can't burn any more carbon, or carbon dioxide, the gas of life? Well, it's not a pretty picture, we can put it that way. Here's another guy, Ottmar Edenhofer. He was the co-chair of the UN IPCC working group, and he was a lead author. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are the pseudoscientists running the UN's climate science. And he says, one must say clearly that we redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore. So, they tell us they're saving the environment, but then at the same time, they tell us this has almost nothing to do with the environment. It has to do with redistributing your wealth to third world dictators, right? They're not even talking about redistributing it to the poor people who actually might benefit from it. They're talking about redistributing it to the dictators who made those people poor. And this was very obvious at the UN summit. My colleague and I from the New American, we got there, and the dictator, the cabal, I call it the dictator cabal, it was the G77 plus Communist China, 134 governments, mostly dictatorships. Communist China, the worst mass murderers in the history of the world. They put out a press release. They sent it to all the journalists, and they said, we're not going to play here unless all the Western countries agree to give us $100 billion per year in reparations for global warming. So, and that's just to start, right? They wanted to scale it up after that. And of course, that's what's in the Paris Agreement. Starting in 2020, Western countries need to give $100 billion of your money per year to this fund, and this fund is going to distribute it to the dictators who have impoverished and enslaved the peoples of the third world. So it's, it's really actually a very sick agenda. It's a dangerous agenda, and it's going to affect all of us, right? I mean, it might be worse for the people in some of these countries, but we're going to suffer quite a great deal as well. They've been pretty frank, too, about what they would like to see. This same woman, Figueres, the chairwoman of the UNFCCC, she gave an interview to Bloomberg, and she said China was doing it right on global warming. She criticized America. She said all these political hurdles and Congress arguing and all these climate skeptics. China's got it right, where the dictator just says what happens and everybody obeys. In China, they also have the one-child policy. You have a lot of these maniacs who think we should have a one-child policy everywhere, right? They consider humans to be a problem. And so that's high on the UN agenda, right? They have a big population control apparatus. They have a UN population fund, and that is high on their agenda. Speech controls. These are a relatively new phenomenon in the West, and that's why I bring up Lysenko in the beginning. They are actually now working on, here in your state, your Attorney General, what's his name, Schneiderman, he is threatening and he is investigating climate skeptics, people who don't believe their little theory, to prosecute them. And he said that maybe fines aren't enough. So he was alluding to possible jail time for the heretics who deny their little theory. So that's how important this theory is to them. They're willing to rip the mask off and just go full totalitarian. They're subpoenaing nonprofit organizations. They want their emails, find out what they've been talking about on climate policy. And this is a dangerous time to be alive. It's a lot of crazy stuff. They want to do RICO prosecutions of the climate deniers. RICO is, of course, the mafia statute, right? They want to treat us as gangsters for not agreeing with their phony theory. And so basically they want full, total control of life at the global level. And obviously this is just one component of this war on America, of this war on humanity that we've been talking about, right? It's a big component. It underpins a lot of the agenda, this global economic regulation, the fundamental economic transformation of the world. So it's an important part of it, but it's, of course, just one part of it, right? Sustainability. So global warming kind of fits into the sustainability fold. Probably a lot of you have heard of Agenda 21. Now they have a new one, right? It's Agenda 2030. So Agenda 21 was kind of for local governments. They wanted to do it by the back door without people realizing. Now they're just doing it out in the open. Agenda 2030 is for national governments and for regional governments. So we'll talk quite a bit about that. This is actually not the exact poster that I saw in Rio, but it's going to be forever burned in my mind. I was at this UN Sustainability Summit. It was chaired by a Chinese communist, Xia Zhakun, who really hates Americans and says so. And it was a poster, and it was a sick Earth, an anthropomorphic Earth, right, with eyes and face, and he had the thermometer just like this one. And the doctor comes and he says, I know your problem. You have humans. And when I saw that, I was just like, no way. They're telling us that they think humans are a disease. What do you do to a disease? You try to eradicate it, right? So, if we're a disease, that's serious, serious stuff. And so these sustainability zealots, they admit openly that they don't think the current population of humanity is sustainable. They want to reduce our numbers, right? And they're willing to go to very unsavory methods to do it. Here we come back to Obama's science czar, Mr. John Holdren. He was actually at this conference in Paris. And in 1977, he wrote a book with another kook, Paul Ehrlich, Eco-Science. And this is a direct quote from the book. Perhaps these agencies, these UN agencies, combined with the UN Environmental Program and the UN Population Agencies, could be developed into a planetary regime. So these are his words, right? And it's sort of an international super agency for population, resources, and environment. Such a comprehensive planetary regime could control development, administration, conservation, and distribution of all natural resources. So that sounds pretty creepy. Here's the book, Eco-Science, and there's John Holdren again. Some of the ideas they were promoting in this book: forced abortions. Women could be forced to abort. And he actually said that under our existing constitution, we could force women to have abortions. Really. You can go pick up the book at your local library if you don't believe me, and I encourage you to do so. He said the population at large, that, you know, us, we could be sterilized involuntarily. They would add drugs to the water supply to sterilize us against our will. This is in his book. This is Obama's science czar, again, in case those aren't clicking. This is the kind of people who are in charge of our government today. They wanted to seize babies from their mothers. They wanted to get rid of undesirables, people who contribute to social deterioration. So, you know, these are the same eugenicist ideas of Margaret Sanger, right? These quack theories on race and what humans are fit to live and what humans are not fit to live. I mean, these guys think of themselves as gods here, right? They're going to decide who lives and dies. They're going to decide who reproduces and who doesn't. You know, these are awesome powers that they're talking about, and these guys are in the highest echelons of power. This is Obama's science czar. He's the head of the science office at the White House. And of course, they wanted their transnational planetary regime to control the global economy and all that other stuff that we talked about. And he wanted an armed international police force. Who could forget the armed international police force? And of course, the middle class will have to go, right? And by middle class, you know, even lower middle class, not sustainable. Here is Maurice Strong. He was the former head of the UN Environment Program. He was also part of the Club of Rome. Big, big guy. He ended up being a billionaire, and then he had to go flee to China because he got in trouble for embezzling money. He died there last year, I believe. But he said, and my colleague Bill Jasper was at the UN summit in Rio, what was it, 23 years ago, and he heard him say this. Current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, high meat intake, fossil fuels, electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, suburban housing, none of these things are sustainable, right? So no more suburban house, no more high meat intake, no more air conditioning. That stuff is all unsustainable. So prepare for life as a caveman or a cavewoman. Here's Agenda 2030. This is kind of their global plan for where they want to take the world. It's very ambitious. It's very transparent. I mean, they openly tell you that we're moving toward global socialism. So let's take a look here at their roadmap for global socialism, fascism, technocracy, whatever you want to call it. They say the slogans, transforming our world and nobody left behind. And that means nobody, right? They emphasize this over and over again. Not one person can escape from this agenda. And they say it over and over again in this document. Climate change and the CO2 war is, of course, a key component, but it's not alone. They refer to Mother Earth, right? We're going to heal Mother Earth by surrendering our liberty and surrendering our sovereignty to the United Nations. Islamic and communist dictators love this, right? In the article here, you can read it if you like, I quote some of the most brutal, barbaric dictators on the planet talking about how wonderful this is. I mean, the Castros, the Robert Mugabes of the world, they think this is a great plan. It's going to usher in a brave new world, as Robert Mugabe put it. Robert Mugabe, of course, is the dictator of Zimbabwe. No Senate ratification, right? So this is a super treaty, but Obama claims it doesn't need to be ratified by the Senate. It's a pseudo treaty. It is a treaty when it's convenient. It's not a treaty. Whatever it is, it's not going to be ratified by the Senate. And it's going to cost trillions, and they brag about the fact that it's going to cost trillions. They have reports. We got to go from billions to trillions to fund Agenda 2030. So what do they say in this Agenda 2030? I had to pick just a few quick highlights, and this was real difficult, so I encourage you to read it. It's actually not that long of a document. Goal number 10, they tell us we're going toward global socialism. We need to reduce inequality within and among countries, right? So it's not enough to have wealth redistribution domestically. We need to have wealth redistribution globally. So global socialism, right? They're flat out saying it. To do that, it will only be possible if the wealth is shared and income inequality is addressed. And by 2030, we have to ensure that all men and women, in particular the poor and the vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources. So, you know, if this sounds like the Soviet Constitution to you, good. It should, because this is where this kind of nonsense is lifted from. And, you know, despite all the nice rhetoric about ending poverty and stuff, we know where this leads, right? We've had 100 years to watch the effects of this. It leads to poverty, misery, mass murder, and terrorism. So we commit to making fundamental changes in the way that our societies produce and consume goods and services. How are they going to do that? Well, they're going to have to control the way that our societies produce and consume goods and services. They want to achieve universal health care coverage, right? So Obamacare on steroids. That includes vaccines for all, and no one shall be left behind. Universal mental health care for everyone who doesn't quite like this plan, doesn't think this smells right, you need some extra mental health care. Sexual and reproductive health care services for everyone. And you know, they don't even conceal it anymore. This actually is just code word for abortion, and they've told us it's code word for abortion. Hillary Clinton has told us this is code word for abortion. So global abortions, global mental health, global vaccines, global wealth redistribution, and of course they're coming for your children. And they tell you they're coming for your children. They say children and young women and men are critical agents of change and will find in the new goals, these Agenda 2030 goals, a platform to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation of a better world. Well, doesn't that sound nice? And then they get into more specifics. By 2030, we're going to ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development. We already talked about what that is. Sustainable lifestyles, right? No air conditioning, no high meat content, no babies, etc. Human rights, and we'll talk about human rights in a little bit. Gender equality, by which they mean radical feminism. Everybody needs to go to the workforce, no more moms staying at home to take care of kids, none of that stuff. Everybody will be the same, everybody will serve the government. And nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity. So, you know, just a quick side note on human rights here, because human rights sounds really nice. How could you be opposed to human rights? Well, go read the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and you'll get a much better picture of what they're talking about, because they tell you what they're talking about. Go to Article 29, and they tell you that none of these rights and privileges may be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So, I mean, that would be like having a First Amendment, and, you know, you have free speech unless your free speech isn't liked by Congress, the Supreme Court, the President, the state legislature. You know, it's a joke. So human rights are the opposite of real rights as we understand them here. And so that's why they want to ensure that all children acquire an understanding of their crazy human rights. So we'll talk real quick about the refugee crisis. Let's see how we're doing on time here. Oop. Okay, so the refugee crisis, we'll look at the numbers, the real agenda, fighting back. So I think the first and maybe one of the most important things to understand here is that the refugee crisis was actually caused by the same people who are demanding that we admit millions and millions and millions of people from the third world. So if you understand that, you get a much better picture of what's happening here, because these are not humanitarians. These are the people who caused this chaos and this crisis to begin with. So the migrants, at least what we're told, is that they're flooding in from Libya, from Syria, from Iraq, and from Afghanistan. If you guys follow the news, I'm sure you realize there's a common pattern there. What do all these countries have in common? Right, we've been there, right? We and the European Union and the UN, we've been meddling there. So in Iraq, we had a UN resolution. President Bush invaded. Christians have almost been exterminated. There was millions of Christians there before the invasion. Now there's a few 100,000, if that. They've been fleeing. You know, in a tragic turn of events, a lot of them fled to Syria. Now they're being butchered there, again, courtesy of these globalists. And Saddam Hussein, of course, was a former ally. We gave him weapons of mass destruction to fight against the Iranians. So there's a lot of commonalities here between all of these countries. Afghanistan, another country where the United States intervened to destroy former U.S. allies. Right? The Taliban and Al-Qaeda were both allies of the American government. This, at this point, is common knowledge. Hillary Clinton was talking about it. So more commonalities, right? A lot of people from Afghanistan, at least saying they're from Afghanistan, are coming into Europe and are being resettled in the United States. Libya. In this case, Obama didn't even bother to ask Congress for permission, not even a fake declaration of war. He just said, well, the UN said they authorized force, and so I'm ordering our forces to go start bombing Libya to smithereens. And what happened? Well, he allied himself with Al-Qaeda. And I know that sounds ridiculous. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. A lot of former generals, former military people, former intelligence agencies have concluded that Obama switched sides in the terror war. We went from being allied with Gaddafi against al-Qaeda and these other jihad guys to being allied with the jihad guys and sending them weapons and helping them to overthrow our former ally Gaddafi. Don't get me wrong, Gaddafi was a monster, but it's just a bizarre situation here where we're going to join forces with al-Qaeda to overthrow somebody who was helping us in the terror war, supposedly. And then we have, of course, Syria, right? Even back when Assad was still an ally of the U.S. government, Assad was helping in the terror war, right? He was torturing suspects for the Bush administration. The Bush administration was sending our tax dollars over to Syria to fund the opposition. They funded opposition satellite services to broadcast in there. They funded opposition forces. And then this all blew up, right? This was quite orchestrated from the outside. They acted like it was spontaneous protest. It was nothing of the sort. And now we see Syria is just, it's rubble, right? It's a tragedy on a scale that I don't think any of us can really comprehend. It's so many dead people. It's so much horror. It's hard to wrap your head around it. So let's talk about this a little bit. Supporting terrorism. Well, bin Laden, of course, was a former U.S. ally. Back during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. government, led, of course, by the same globalists, they decided to partner with the most horrible forces in Afghanistan under the guise of fighting against the Soviet Union. There was a lot of decent forces fighting against the Soviet Union. They were fighting off communist invaders who were trying to enslave them. And of course, the U.S. government chose the worst possible guys they could ally themselves with, the bin Ladens, the Talibans, the Mujahideen, and started sending them weapons and radicalizing them and giving them training and missile launchers and so on. Then ISIS has also been supported by Obama's anti-ISIS coalition, and we'll see a little bit of evidence for that. So here's Biden, Vice President Joe Biden. I know he says a lot of dumb stuff, so we can't always take what he says seriously, but he did admit in a speech at Harvard, you can find this on YouTube, I encourage you to watch it, he says there was no moderate middle in Syria. Do you guys remember when Obama was telling us he was arming the moderate middle? The moderate rebels who were opposed to Assad. Well, here's Biden telling us there was no moderate middle, right? And we'll see more evidence that there was no so-called moderate middle. He says that our allies, his allies, right, the Sunni Islamic dictatorships in the Gulf and in Turkey, were pouring thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight Assad, and the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra, that's another name for al-Qaeda in Syria, and al-Qaeda, and the extremist elements of the jihadis. And all of a sudden, everybody is awakened because of this outfit called ISIL, it's ISIS, the Islamic State, whatever you want to call it, which was al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space in eastern Syria, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them. So here Biden is kind of engaging in some deception, right? He acts like the Obama administration had nothing to do with this, which is false. The CIA and the State Department were deeply involved in this at every step of the way. But here we have a confession from our vice president that Obama's anti-ISIS coalition was arming, funding, and training ISIS. So, if you don't want to believe Biden, I can understand. He's kind of strange. We call him impeachment insurance, right? So maybe he's just blabbering. But here's General Dempsey. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at this time. They asked him in Senate testimony, so do you know of any Arab allies of some Obama's anti-ISIS coalition who are supporting ISIS? And he said, he bettered them. He said, I know of major Arab allies who fund them. So he was talking, of course, about the Saudis, the Qataris, etc. Here you have a bunch of ISIS guys with American weaponry. So we also have a smoking gun here, straight from the Pentagon. This came out in a lawsuit last year, filed by Judicial Watch. They were looking into Benghazi, and this just happened to emerge among the trove of documents. And the plan has been admitted since 2012. This comes from the Defense Intelligence Agency. You can read the report yourself. They say the Salafist is kind of radical Islam, what they have in Saudi Arabia. The Muslim Brotherhood and al-Qaeda in Iraq are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. So they told us right there who's the major forces driving the insurgency, right? We know it's al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood. And then right here, they tell us that the West, the Gulf countries, and Turkey support the Syrian opposition. So who's the Syrian opposition? Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists, right? So, and here comes the best part, or depending on how you look at it, there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria. And this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want in order to isolate the Syrian regime. And they got it, right? We call it the Islamic State today. It's called ISIS. They're chopping off heads and butchering people right and left. So here is the plan. This is exactly what the powers supporting the Syrian opposition want. Who were the powers supporting the Syrian opposition? Here we have the list again, right? The West, the Obama administration, the European governments, the European Union, NATO, the Gulf countries, the Saudi dictatorship, the Qatari dictatorship. So they told us what they wanted to do. This was a Defense Intelligence Agency report from 2012. Couldn't be more clear, right? Here's some more pictures of ISIS with American Humvees, American tanks, American guns, American pickup trucks. Here is John McCain with some of his buddies over in Syria. And of course, we're helping both sides, actually all three sides, because there are multiple sides in this conflict. We're supporting the militias from Iraq, the Shia militias that are fighting with Assad's forces against ISIS. We're supporting ISIS, and we're supporting the Kurds. And a lot of people have heard good things about the Kurds. The people who are being supported by the Obama administration are on the list of terrorist groups. The PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, is a terrorist group, a communist terrorist group that is most infamous probably for bombing civilians and killing police officers and so on. So this is all very serious federal crimes, but you know, the prosecutors are probably not going to hold their bosses accountable. So we have this flood into Europe, right? Probably more than 2 million refugees arrived in the EU last year, and this year even more are going to be coming. More than 2/3 of the Syrians registered in Greece and Italy were men. About 3/4 of the refugees who have come to the EU are men, according to the United Nations. So, you know, I want people to think about this, all the men in the audience. Would you leave your wife and your kids in a war zone and head to Europe? Okay, right. I mean, there's probably not 1 in a million who would do that. It's absolutely absurd. So something else is going on here. More than 90% of the unaccompanied minors are male, and I have unaccompanied minors in quotes because a lot of them are not minors. You know, they're 25, 30 years old. They say they're 17. They throw away their passport, and then they get, you know, all kinds of welfare, immediate residency permits, etc. And this tsunami is growing by the day. And the last 2 times that this many Islamic men were marching into Europe, they were opposed militarily, right? It was part of a jihad. The first time they were stopped at the Battle of Tours around the year 800. Next time after that, they were stopped at the gates of Vienna about 800 years after that. So this time, they're being welcomed in and they're being given welfare and weapons training in Sweden, believe it or not, and lots of other crazy stuff. So, Europe on the brink, you have terrorism and jihad, right? We've seen a lot of terrorist attacks recently. They just had the big one in Brussels. Before that, they had some in Paris. What was it, 500 casualties in the one in Paris? Really serious stuff. There's going to be a lot more of that coming, I can assure you. And it's not an accident, right? These people are not stupid. The European Union is not made up of a bunch of idiots who said, oops, what have we done? Now we have a lot of terrorism, right? This was part of the plan all along. We've had mass sexual assaults. The big one happened in Cologne. You have more than 1,000 so-called refugee men were involved in a mass sexual assault at the train station there on New Year. And this has been happening all over. Now we're finding out that the police have been covering it up to get away with letting all this so-called refugees in. But this has been happening on a broad scale. We have these no-go zones. They're real. I've been there. You don't see any natives in these areas. You get a lot of nasty looks. It's open drug dealing, you know, right in the center of town. Police don't dare to come in unless they come in multiple cars. You know, these are real. There's a number of them in Sweden, in Germany, in France. They're proliferating in Belgium. And we're going to be seeing a lot more of that, of course, with all these new arrivals. You have Pakistani gangs in the United Kingdom. We're grooming hundreds of children, some as young as 13. Nobody wanted to do anything about it because nobody wanted to be called racist or you know, xenophobic or anything. So they just let this happen for a long time. The government was aware of this for a long time, but they didn't want to be undiverse. You have towns now in Germany where locals outnumber, or where locals are outnumbered by refugees. And at the current rate, in Sweden, if refugees, or so-called refugees, keep arriving at this rate, native Swedes will be a minority in their own country within 15 years. So, you know, this is a huge flood of people, and nations are literally at risk. Nations that have existed for thousands of years will exist no more if this continues. Now, you know, presumably, this can't continue indefinitely. The whole thing would fall apart. But if it did, Swedes would be outnumbered very quickly. The burden on taxpayers is incalculable, and it's getting worse. So here is Mr. Gaddafi, total lunatic, bloodthirsty monster. But he said, and maybe this was prophetic, I don't know, there are signs that Allah will grant Islam victory in Europe without swords, without guns, without conquest, and will turn it into a Muslim continent within a few decades, right? He was bragging that there was already 50 million Muslims in Europe and how wonderful this is. Now, are the globalists Muslim? Do they secretly want to make Europe Muslim? No, of course not, right? So there's something else going on here. They don't want a Muslim Europe. They're doing this for another reason. So Obama, of course, wants to have a refugee surge here in the United States as well. They're importing as many as they think they can get away with. They accepted 70,000 through a UN program last year. They're planning for 100,000 this year, and these are just refugees, right? These are not workers. These are not people coming across illegally from the southern border. These are just refugees that American taxpayers are paying to resettle. 10,000 refugees cost taxpayers about $6.5 billion. So, multiply that out, we're talking about some serious money. And that's probably an underestimate. We have more on that in the latest issue of the New American. They're expecting 75,000 unaccompanied minor children this year. They're using tax-funded religious groups to resettle these refugees. We had over 500,000 visa overstays in 2015, and Obama is, of course, trying to grant amnesty to 5 million illegal immigrants. He wants to make them all future Democrat voters, and they want to have a permanent big government voting bloc while, in Obama's words, fundamentally transforming the country, and that's what they're up to here, right? It's not because they're humanitarians, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So what is the UN's role in all this? Well, actually, it's huge. We don't see the UN, but it is a key player in all of this. They have a bureaucracy called the High Commission for Refugees, and they select the refugees that are coming here to the United States. And they pre-screen them, supposedly, put them on a list, and they ship them to the United States to be resettled here at our expense. Now, a few details will tell us some more about this. The High Commissioner on Refugees, until just a few months ago, actually, was Antonio Guterres. He was the head of Socialist International until 2005. Socialist International, for those of you who don't know, it's the global alliance of socialist, Marxist, communist parties. A lot of bloodthirsty, mass-murdering political parties involved in this. It is a nasty group. A few years ago, they had their meeting down with the ANC, their annual Congress, and this was during the genocide warning by Genocide Watch. They said the ANC was at stage 6 of 8 on the genocide scale. 8 is, of course, denial after the fact, and so they decided to celebrate by having their annual Congress down with the ANC. Almost no Middle Eastern Christians are coming through this UN program. 10% of the population of Syria was Christian, probably more after all the Iraqi Christians who had to flee from Iraq because they were being butchered there. And for some reason, only 3% of the Syrians who have come to the United States under this program have been Christian. So something very strange is going on there. Should ask some questions. And the U.S. accepts more of these UN refugees than all other countries combined. The U.S. accepts the majority of refugees coming through this UN High Commission on Refugees. One of the key agendas is, of course, the assault on national sovereignty. We'll look at some of these people talking about that openly in just a moment. In the EU, they're building a regional military force, right, an EU military force that will serve the regime in Brussels rather than the nation states, and this is being accomplished under the guise of dealing with this refugee crisis that they created. This military force will be able to intervene in countries against the will of the local government there. So even if the national government says, no, we don't want your military force here, they're coming anyways, and they tell you they're coming anyways. They're also going to fight crime and terror, supposedly. We're going to need a biometric ID to go in or out of the EU, again, to deal with the terrorism that they are deliberately fomenting. They're trying to create an EU immigration refugee agency with the power to decide immigration policy for all of Europe. So far, a few national governments have resisted, but this is coming. And then in the Middle East, they're using the refugee crisis to build a Middle Eastern Union. So you have the finance minister in Germany and George Soros talking about we need a new Marshall Plan to rebuild the Middle East so that the refugees will stop coming, right? So they destroy the Middle East, then they say we need a new Marshall Plan to rebuild the Middle East. And for those of you who know what the Marshall Plan was, it was the key instrument that was used, and we talk about this in this book. Actually, we just quote the people directly talking about it, the people responsible for it. They used the Marshall Plan as a source of funds and as a source of incentives to create the EU in the first place, because they knew they couldn't merge the United States and Europe or create this world federalist system without a regional government for Europe, so they used the Marshall Plan to advance that. Now they want to use the exact same strategy in the Middle East, and they want to build a Middle East Union, and of course taxpayers will pay for all this. And of course they're going to undermine the national culture, the national identity in the name of diversity. In Sweden, you already had the head of the Swedish church saying, let's take the crosses off of our churches so that we don't offend the new arrivals. So, you know, they're destroying their own history, they're destroying their own identity, and this was all part of the plan. Here's the Council on Foreign Relations. I just took this right from their website. The EU offers a model for unifying the Middle East, right? So that is the plan. They want a Middle Eastern Union to rule over the Middle East. And here's, straight from the horse's mouth again. I say I'm not a huge fan of quotes, but I think it's helpful to people to see these guys talking about it on their own. So this is the UN Migration Czar. His name is Peter Sutherland. He was the chairman of Goldman Sachs, steering committee member of the Bilderberg Group. For some of you, that probably doesn't mean anything, but I think a lot of you know. And anyways, he said he's going to ask the governments to cooperate to recognize sovereignty is an illusion, and that sovereignty is an absolute illusion, and it has to be put behind us. The days of hiding behind borders and fences are long gone. We have to work together and cooperate to make a better world, and who doesn't want a better world, right? And that means taking on some of the old shibboleths, these historic memories and images of our own country, and we just have to recognize we're all humankind. Who created the nations again? Does anybody remember? God created the nations, right? And so these guys don't like the nations. They want to get rid of the nations. Here's George Soros, Dr. Evil, I call him. He says, our plan treats the protection of refugees as the objective and national borders as the obstacle. So national borders are the obstacle. Is that clear? He couldn't have been more clear, right? National borders are the obstacle. There are some people fighting back. Here's Viktor Orban. He is the Prime Minister of Hungary, and he was also a Soros scholar. He got a scholarship from Soros to attend university, so this is interesting. But anyways, he says a lot of things. He gave a brilliant speech where he outlined exactly what was happening here. He explained that there's a treasonous conspiracy, those are his words, a treasonous conspiracy, to undermine Europe. He says that these refugees are not refugees, but Europe is threatened by migration. Tens of millions are ready to set off in their direction. It's forbidden to say that immigration brings crime and terror. It's forbidden to point out that the masses arriving from other civilizations endanger our way of life, our culture, our customs, and our traditions, our Christian traditions. It's no accident, right? It's a pre-planned and orchestrated operation. So this is Prime Minister of Hungary. He says it's forbidden to say that in Brussels they're concocting schemes to transport foreigners here as quickly as possible. It's forbidden to point out that the purpose of this is to reshape the religious and cultural landscape of Europe, to re-engineer the ethnic foundations and thereby eliminate the last barrier to internationalism or globalism, whatever you want to call it, the nation states. So, this is actually what's happening. It's pretty amazing to see a national level politician say it, but there you go, right? So you weren't imagining stuff, right? The politician said it too, so now we can agree. So part of the agenda is an assault on liberty. Of course, this should go without saying almost. The EU has announced they're going to have a new unit at Europol. Europol is a real thing. It's a European police agency, and they're going to censor extremism from the internet. So what is extremism? Well, the Bible is extremism. Christianity is extremism. Opposition to homosexual so-called marriage is extremism. That's the extremism they're talking about, but they're using Islam and radical Islam as the excuse to advance all this, right? They say we need a new EU intelligence agency, so we're going to have another CIA, like we don't have enough with one CIA. Germans are right now being arrested for criticizing this. If they criticize the immigration too loudly, if they criticize Islam too loudly, they're getting SWAT team visits to their house, they're having their places searched, and they're being hauled off to jail for what's called hate speech. And we're going to see a lot more of that. We saw a lot of it in France recently, and this is just the beginning. Terrorism is being used, of course, to justify gun control. Right after the Paris attacks, they said we need more gun control, even though guns are basically banned almost everywhere in Europe. How can you have more gun control, right? We're going to have speech restrictions, more spying, right? We need to give up all our liberties. And Muslims are being used as an excuse to register and spy on Sunday schools, right? In the UK, they have this new program. They said extremism is bad. We don't like radical extremism. So now we need to register all the Sunday schools at all the churches. We need to crack down on homeschooling because parents might be brainwashing their kids and so on. So they're importing all the Muslims and then they're using the Muslims as an excuse to take away our liberties. It's quite clever from their perspective, quite evil, I would think, from the perspective of someone who loves liberty and their country. So, is the agenda humanitarianism? They tell us they're humanitarian, right? They're humanitarian. It's hard not to laugh at that. It's really so ridiculous that you would, and this is a metaphor I use, if you burned down someone's house and then invited them into your neighbor's house, would that make you a humanitarian? No, right? That would make you a criminal. And that's exactly what these people have done. They've burned down other people's houses, they've bombed their nations to smithereens, and now they're inviting them into your house at your expense to take care of them. And of course, these people who are coming in are upset. They just had their country destroyed by your military. So, this is really an outrageous situation, but it's certainly not a humanitarian situation. And just the numbers, right? They speak for themselves. You could support 25 times to 50 times more refugees with food, water, housing, education, health care in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey than you could in Sweden or Germany or France or the United States. So basically, anytime you take a refugee to Sweden or to the United States, that's 50 who could have been supported in Lebanon. What kind of humanitarian? I mean, you'd have to be a really dumb humanitarian if that was the way you did your math, right? It wouldn't make any sense. Who's going to rebuild these countries now? We're, bringing all the able-bodied young men over here. Who's going to rebuild these countries? It's, it's a fraud. It's certainly not humanitarianism. Then, people caught on to the humanitarianism fraud, so now they have a new excuse. Oh, well, Europeans didn't have enough babies, right? And so now who's going to take care of all the old people if we don't bring in all these refugees? And that's another lie. It's very easy to discredit. The few studies that have been done, actually I know of one that was done in Sweden, show that the migrants are going to be an economic burden on the taxpayer as far as you can see. There is no point as of yet that we know of. We can't say in 20 years they'll contribute to the tax base. We don't know. It's, as of now, indefinite. They're going to be a burden on the taxpayer. So these are not going to take care of the older people in their old age, right? So both of these are lies. It's not humanitarianism. It's not because we need new workers. So, you just have to think back to who caused this chaos in the first place. Who blew up the countries in the first place? Well, humanitarians don't do that, right? So the goal is what these guys call a new world order. I was going to show you guys a video of George Bush and Bill Clinton and Joe Biden all talking about the wonderful new world order. They tell us what it is, right? And we'll have some quotes from them. But the process, and we'll see this in a minute outlined by the architects of this themselves, is to divide the world up into these regional governments. You have the African Union. This already exists. It has its own military. It has its own parliament. It has its own institutions. And, it's all financed by Communist China, by the U.S. taxpayer, and by the European Union. So, it's certainly not a ground-up type thing, but it exists. It's got troops deployed in different places. We have the Eurasian Union, right? Putin is building his own union. We have the European Union, where they're building the Middle East Union. They wanted a North American Union, although the architect of this, Robert Pastor, blamed the John Birch Society, those darn Birchers, getting in the way of his schemes. Then you have the Union of South American States, which this is a real thing. It exists already. It's run by a bunch of communists and socialists and Marxist criminals. They said that they wanted to rebuild in South America what was lost in Eastern Europe, communist tyranny, of course. And then we have Ban Ki-moon. He said this recently, that the United Nations is the parliament of humanity. So parliament, of course, is a sovereign body with the power to make laws, and that is what's happening here. So they want a global system that's going to control education, the economy, the population, and much more. They want a global currency that's based on the Federal Reserve model. Basically, fiat paper money, not backed by anything, essentially debt money, right, that's impossible to pay off. They create the principal, but they don't create the interest, but they charge you interest on the money, so you can't pay it off. It's a brilliant scam if you can pull it off. And then let's see what they have to say in their own words, right? Here's Henry Kissinger. I was just talking a minute ago about the regional model for this new world order. This is his recent book. It just came out at the end of 2014. He says, and just substitute the word order for government, if you will, and you'll see what he's talking about. The contemporary quest for world order will require a coherent strategy to establish a concept of order within the various regions, right, European Union, African Union, and to relate these regional orders to one another. So the quest for world government, you need regional governments, and then you'll build these into the global system. And he's not the first one to say that. We had A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations, published by our own State Department. They outlined the same strategy. They said we're going to use war and the threat of war to convince people to join these ridiculous regional governments. George H.W. Bush, he went on TV. He told us, right, when he was invading Iraq, the first Bush. He said, he defined a new world order. He says, an order in which a credible United Nations, do you guys want to see a credible United, can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders. So, anyone who knows about the UN's founders, that would be alarm bells going off, right? Alger Hiss was our negotiator, the first Secretary General of the UN. He later got busted for being a Soviet spy, convicted in a court of law for lying about it. So, you had the Soviets, the Soviet agent representing America, and that's the UN founders, right? Isn't that great? Then we have George Soros. He thinks that we need a new world order and that China has to be part of this new world order. They have to be part of the process of creating it, and they have to buy in, and they even have to own it in the same way as the United States owns the current order. So who wants to live in a new world order owned by China? Right? Hopefully none of us. And so here in this book, World Federalism 101, we talk about, actually we don't talk about, we let these guys talk for themselves, because until not too long ago, this was out in the open. They were introducing resolutions into Congress to create a world federal government. They'd had presidents on both sides of the aisle openly supporting it, leaders in Congress on both sides of the aisle openly supporting this. And this is, the agenda. It was not hidden not so long ago. So they wanted to merge the United States and Europe. That movement has been around for generations, but they knew that they would never be able to do it as long as European states were independent, right? You couldn't merge the United States with a bunch of small independent European countries. So they said, we'll use a Marshall Plan to unify Europe in a single political and economic system, and then it'll be easier to merge them. Today, probably a lot of you guys have heard of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. That is a plan to merge the United States and the European Union. So they'll bypass the North American Union and just move straight toward this transatlantic union. They were going to set up transatlantic bureaucracies, transatlantic courts, transatlantic institutions that will be beyond the reach of the American voter. So again, this plan for world federalism was openly discussed. We got tons of quotes straight from the congressional record. You can read them yourself if you're interested. And a conspiracy requires secrecy by definition. So, there certainly is an element of conspiracy to this, but the fact that people in positions of power want a world government is not a conspiracy. They say they want a world government. They said so in the congressional record. So that is not a conspiracy. That is just a fact. It's in the open. So, possible causes of Americans' decline. It could be an evolution of historical forces, right? It could be mistakes, could be, or it could be deliberate action. And I think this quote is really good. The first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, he was only the first Secretary of Defense because it didn't used to be called that, but he said, consistency has never been the mark of stupidity. If the diplomats who have mishandled our relations with Russia were merely stupid, they would occasionally make a mistake in our favor, right? And that's obvious. Again, with the monkeys rolling the dice, every once in a while, they would be right? They would do something good for us. And insiders have told us about this. Here's a book. I actually have it. I bought it from my local chapter leader way back in the day in Florida. Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. So Bill Clinton mentioned Carroll Quigley as one of his mentors, actually the only guy he mentioned in his acceptance speech. And in this book, he says a lot of excellent quotes come from this book about the real agenda. He had the opportunity to review their papers. And he says the agenda was nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. And you can get this book. It's still available. You can order it on Amazon. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert by secret meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was going to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. The Federal Reserve, the system, is actually private corporations. They're owned by shareholders, and they say so. They file court documents saying we don't have to obey freedom of information laws. We're a private corporation. So, what is this system? Who are we talking about? Well, the Council on Foreign Relations is, the American branch of this system, if you will. It's a very powerful organization. We have an excellent book in the back and this reprint here, Council on Foreign Relations. I highly recommend it. If you don't know about this organization, you need to. It's right at the center of so much of what's wrong, so much of what we're talking about here today. The Trilateral Commission, founded by David Rockefeller, quite similar to the Council on Foreign Relations. It's Japan, Europe, and the United States. The Bilderberg Group, once a year, these guys meet, top people in military, banking, finance, business, government, you name it, they're there. I've been to a few of them, not in them, of course, but I've been to a few of them reporting for the New American. I was at the Copenhagen one in 2014. That was interesting. One of the guys came out and talked to us. That was weird. So we got G20 summits, of course, are a big part of this, and the secret meetings and conferences, right? They have a lot of those. Hillary Clinton tells us that we get a lot of advice from the Council on Foreign Relations, so this will mean this was when they were setting up a branch in D.C. So this will mean I won't have to go as far to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future. So Hillary Clinton tells us who tells her what to be doing and how to think about the future, right? Straight from the horse's mouth. So who are they? Well, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, all these guys. Dick Cheney, right? There's a good video of him on YouTube laughing at us for being so stupid. He says, oh, yeah, I've been a director for a long time, but I didn't broadcast that when I was running for Congress in Wyoming. So that's really funny, right? Trick the dumb voters. But there you go, right? Supreme Court justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Jacob Lew, Obama's Treasury Secretary, John Kerry, of course, usual suspects, Rick Warren, et cetera, Soros, who could forget Soros. So that's who they are, right? They have names. Every administration has been packed with these guys from the CFR and the Trilateral Commission, right? And I mean packed, packed, packed. Cabinet level positions across the board. It doesn't matter Republican, Democrat, that's just for the public, right? So Carter had 284 of these guys in his administration. Reagan had 313. Bush 382, Clinton 548, and Obama's got 379. So, you know, you see a pattern here, right? It doesn't matter what party they come from, they do the same thing. Again, here's some, you know, if you want to read more on this, I highly recommend you do the Council on Foreign Relations. This is kind of the masterpiece exposing this, and this is actually, what, 20 years old maybe? But great book. I mean, he exposes this so well, you know, it's brilliant. And then the Council on Foreign Relations here, it's a reprint from the New American. So now the solution, right? And then after this, I promise I'm done and you guys can go home. But solution, so what do we do about this? This is obviously a pretty big problem. I hope you're convinced of that after seeing it from their own words, right? And so now we know we have a big problem. Now what do we do about this problem? My first and foremost recommendation is that we pray, right? We need to ask God to guide us and to lead us and to help us and to give us wisdom in this, because this is, you know, it's a monumental challenge. It's huge. And it's so important. If we mess up here, you know, the consequences are going to be really serious. So I recommend, first of all, we pray, right? We ask God for guidance and for wisdom in dealing with this. And then we need to educate ourselves, right? We need to read. I once heard someone say that they hide all the secrets in the library, and it's true. You know, the information is out there. We just need to read it. They're not going to put it on TV. They're not going to print it on the front page of your local newspaper, but it's not because it's not there. It is there. We just need to pick up a book, go to the library, order it from Amazon, whatever you need to do, just get a book and read it. Right? And so I recommend reading the Bible, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, learn about economics, theology, philosophy, history, science, keep up on the news, you know, read the classics. You know, we need to be well-rounded and educated individuals if we're going to be fighting back against this system. Educate your children and protect them from the stuff we were talking about at the beginning of this presentation, right? They intend to dumb down your child. They intend to make your child illiterate. They intend to turn your child into a humanist who hates God and who rejects everything that you believe. You can't let them do that. You have an obligation as parents, as grandparents, to protect your kids, and there's a lot of ways to do that, right? You can homeschool them. You can put them in a good Christian school. There's, you know, people from some good Christian schools here tonight. 2 of them, I think, advertised in the program. You know, if you can't homeschool, there are other options, but you do need to protect your kids. That's, you know, our most basic duty as parents. God entrusted us with these children. We cannot surrender them to the enemy. That's crazy. So protect your kids from the dumbing down. Teach them to read with phonics, right? If your kids can read, they can educate themselves. And that's why they want to dumb them. That's why they want to use this quack method that they use in the schools, because they don't want your kids reading. So teach your kids to read with phonics. Teach your grandkids to read with phonics. They'll thank you for it, and you know, you'll be doing the world a favor, not just your kids or your grandkids. Educate others, right? Your neighbors, your friends, especially target opinion molders. If you know, radio hosts, journalists, businessmen, educate people around you who you have influence with, who can influence others. Because this is really the key. We need to educate ourselves, educate others. That's how we're going to stop this. Don't be misled by dividers, and they're always on the, oh, it's the rich people who did it, it's the poor people sucking up all the welfare, it's the black people, it's the white people, it's the Jews, it's the Catholics. It's none of those things. It's none of those things, right? They just want to divide us, and they just want to keep us separate. And I use the Wizard of Oz metaphor, right? You don't want people looking behind the curtain. So it's better to keep everybody fighting among themselves than realizing, where the problem really lies. They don't want us looking behind the curtain, so they'll throw in any kind of division. Now the feminists, oh, it's the men keeping us down, the patriarchy, right? Anything to distract from the real issues. And subscribe to the New American. And I don't say that just because I write for the New American. It's a great, great magazine. It's, I think the best way to stay informed on current affairs. They have a history article in every issue. Just so valuable a resource in terms of staying educated and keeping up to date on things. The John Birch Society. There is a group that has been fighting this battle for 50 years. I discovered it completely by accident, actually surfing through YouTube videos when I was in college. Found one about the UN, and I was like, whoa, really? Because I had been brainwashed to think the UN was a great organization. Then I found out that these peacekeeping troops were murdering and raping and slaughtering people in Katanga because they didn't want to live under a UN-approved, Soviet-backed communist dictator. So that was kind of a wake-up call. And I was really happy to know that there were people already involved in this fight, people who knew what was the deal and who knew how to fight back. So the motto is to bring about less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world, right? That's a good motto. I think we can all get behind that, providing leadership, education, and organized volunteer action in accordance with moral and constitutional principles. So, you know, you might have heard bad things about the JBS, and of course we're dealing with, you know, a rather powerful set of people who have very sinister designs for our future. So of course they would say bad things about JBS. You know, go to a chapter meeting and see if it's true. Pick up some of the literature and see if it's true. It's not. And you know, once you realize that they've been lying about the JBS, I think you'll realize they've been lying about a lot of other things too. So the JBS has a lot of educational materials, good leadership that, you know, can help us focus. You know, if we work together, we can actually win a lot of these battles. If we're all, you know, off doing our own thing, it's a lot harder to successfully fight back. There's chapters in all 50 states, so no matter where you are, you have no excuse, right? Get involved. Here's Robert Welch, the founder. Ed talked about him a little bit at the beginning. Really amazing guy. This is what he said. There's a conspiracy at work as sure as there is a law of gravity. And to try to overcome its effects by ignoring its existence is exactly the kind of opposition that the conspiracy has contrived for itself. So we stand solidly on our position that the only way to stop this conspiracy is to expose it. And that's pretty logical, right? I think it's a really, really good statement. And, you know, lest you think there's no conspiracy, that's a conspiracy theory. Well, no, it's a conspiracy fact. Here's David Rockefeller. He admits it right here, right? So this is from his memoirs. You can buy his memoirs. You can get it from the library if you don't want to give him money. Some even believe that we, the Rockefeller family, are part of a secret cabal. Notice the words he uses, a secret cabal, working against the best interests of the United States. That's pretty serious stuff right there. Characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring, see, he uses the word, not me, with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it. So he's proud of conspiring with others against the best interests of his country. Conspiring, right? He used the word, not me. So there you go. So what kind of strategies? Well, the Constitution is the solution, right? So people are telling us we need to amend the Constitution to solve this problem. No, we don't. We need to obey the Constitution. You know, all the stuff that we need is right there in the Constitution. If the politicians would obey it, we wouldn't be in this mess. So that's the solution right there, right? Not amending it, not opening it up to revisions. So what about when the Congress and the Obama administration and the Supreme Court ignore the Constitution? That happens, right? Well, we have other tools to deal with that. We have state and local nullification. Right? State governments can nullify unconstitutional usurpations by the federal government. And you know, the federal supremacists, as I call them, will say, no, that's not true. You defend slavery. You defend, you know, all these other bad things. Well, no, that's not true, right? One of the best known examples of the use of nullification was actually to protect slaves who had run away from their masters. Wisconsin nullified the Fugitive Slave Act. They said, no, we're not sending the slaves back to their owners. We're going to keep them here, regardless of what your little federal law says. So that's wonderful, you know. And then the liberals will say, well, you can't nullify gun control. Well, yeah, we can, right? There's a number of states that have done it, the Firearms Freedom Act, and the liberals are using nullification, right? Go ask a pothead in Colorado. Right? They don't know it by this word, but there's a federal statute that says you can't smoke pot. There's a UN convention that says you can't smoke pot. And in Colorado, they're smoking pot, right? And we don't have to like pot to agree that they're using nullification. So if liberals can use it, why can't we? Right? So if we nullify unconstitutional usurpations, we can start reining in the federal government. And part of that, too, is not accepting the federal bribe money. Right? The federal government is giving out a lot of money to our state governments to encourage this kind of lawlessness and to get our states involved. So we need to tell our state governments to stop accepting the bribe money with the strings that come attached. Defund the programs. Right? The House of Representatives still controls the purse strings. That's what the Constitution says. You know, they say, oh, well, Obama's doing this, and all the congressmen, all the Republicans, right? We're going to stop Obama. Oh, how do we do that? Well, they know very well that they can just stop providing funding, and Obama can't do anything without funding, right? He doesn't have a magical checkbook that just, you know, creates money. The House of Representatives has to fund it. So we do have all these tools. Get us out of the United Nations, right? That would be another excellent step. That would set the conspirators back by a lot, right? The UN is a tool that they use, and it's a very important tool that they use. If we can get the United States out of the UN, we will have won a very big victory. There's legislation in Congress to do this right now. It's called the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. If your congressman is not a co-sponsor, you should find out why. So get active. Once you're educated, work to create an informed electorate, right? This is going to be key. Reach out to your sphere of influence, your friends, your relatives, opinion molders. Impact your community by providing leadership and information to community leaders and opinion molders. Follow the JBS national agenda, right? The JBS comes out with a bulletin that tells, let's work on stopping the free trade agreements that are going to surrender our sovereignty. And if everybody across the country is working on this thing at the same time, we have a real chance of getting it done. If we're all doing our own thing, it's a lot harder. So, let's work together. Let's get these things done. We can work to elect constitutionalists and statesmen, not politicians. And I don't mean to pick on anybody who loves Ted Cruz or Donald Trump. I don't know if they're good or bad. I really don't know. But don't get burned out and don't get sidetracked with the presidential campaigns too much. The establishment has the presidential campaign on lock. They're not about to let little old us influence their plans there. So let's worry about Congress. Let's worry about what we can accomplish and not get burned out, not get all torn up and disappointed when our presidential candidate doesn't get elected. We're not going to take back this country by electing a good president, unfortunately. Right? It's very difficult. One president can't fix this problem. What we need is an informed electorate. There are no shortcuts. If someone says there's a silver bullet to fix this, there's not. Right? There just isn't. And so don't be misled by that kind of stuff. And that's all I have, guys. So thank you very much. God bless you all, and God bless America.